all, the Harlem riots actually shouldn't surprise anyone. It's only an example of why the passage of the recent Civil Rights Bill in the United States can do actually or absolutely nothing to solve the problems that confront our people there. Despite the passage of this bill, our people are still the victims of brutality, and most of them are being brutalized by the police here in the North, or rather in the North, instead of in the South. It's surprising to me that the racial explosion, hasn't gotten farther out of hand than it actually has. And it's not a reflection of the ability of the New York police to contain the Negroes in Harlem. It's actually a reflection of the ability of the Negroes in Harlem to hold or exercise restraint in the face of the most severe form of brutality.
Lieutenant Thomas Gilligan served 17 years in the police department and had a few notable entries to his record. Before the Powell incident, he had shot 2 other men. One of those men was trying to push him off a roof, and the other, much younger, was looting cars in front of his apartment. Citations in the New York Daily News reported that Gilligan had disarmed suspects in the past. Physically, Gilligan was a man of 6 feet tall. To the sound of broken glass, Gilligan ran to the apartment building holding his badge and gun. He first yelled, "I'm a police lieutenant, come out and drop it." He then fired the warning shot as he saw Powell raising his knife. With his gun, Gilligan blocked Powell's second attack, deflecting the knife to his arm. The apparent attack led to Gilligan firing a 3rd round that killed young Powell. James Powell was a 9th grader in the Bronx, attending summer school at the Robert F. Wagner Senior Junior High School on East 76th Street. After his father's death, neighbours said the young boy had become a little wild. He had 4 minor altercations with the law. He twice attempted to board a subway or a bus without paying, broke a car window, and attempted robbery, from which he was cleared. Physically, he was 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 122 pounds. In opposition to what Gilligan had said, witnesses saw Powell run into the building, not carrying any knife. As he exited the vestibule, some said that he was laughing until the lieutenant had shot him. From the point of view of the French class, which according to New York Times reporter Theodore Jones, had the best view of the ensuing tragedy, when Gilligan pulled his gun, young Powell threw up his right arm, not holding a knife, but as a defensive gesture. The most controversial episode remains the testimony of Cliff Harris, Powell's Bronx friend, interviewed the day following the death of James Powell. On the morning James Powell, Cliff Harris, and Carl Dudley left the Bronx around 7:30 a.m. Powell carried 2 knives on that day, which he gave to each of his friends to be held for him. On the scene, he asked for the knives back. Upon Dudley's refusal, he asked Cliff, who asked him why he wanted it back, and then handed it over. The knife, which was not seen on the crime scene at the moment of the incident, was later found by a teacher. According to school principal Frankie, the knife was situated in the gutter about 8 feet from the body. Consistently annoyed by the presence of young students on his stoops, Patrick Lynch, the superintendent of 3 apartment houses in Yorkville, at the time a predominantly working-class white area on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, hosed down the black students while insulting them. The angry black students started to pick up bottles and garbage can lids and threw them at the superintendent. This immediately drew the attention of 3 Bronx boys, including James Powell. Lynch then retreated to the inside of the building, pursued by Powell, who, according to a witness, didn't stay 2 minutes. As Powell exited the vestibule, off-duty police Lieutenant Thomas Gilligan, who witnessed the scene from a nearby shop, ran to the scene and shot at the 15-year-old James Powell 3 times. The first round, said to be a warning shot, hit the apartment window. The next shot hit Powell in the right forearm, reaching the main artery just above the heart. The bullet lodged in his lungs, and finally the last one went through his abdomen and out his back. The autopsy concluded on the fatality of the chest wound in almost any circumstance. However, the pathologist said that Powell could have been saved suffering under the abdominal shot with a fast response from the ambulance. The sequence of events is still unclear on many aspects, such as the spacing of the shots and, crucially, Powell's possession of a knife. Day 1 of the riot had been contained by 75 police officers. Briefly, it had happened right after the shooting of James Powell, and the police department was securing the crime scene from approximately 300 people. the majority of whom were students. The confrontations between students and policemen foreshadowed on the next morning protest. On the morning after the shooting, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, showed up at the school nearby the scene. They demanded a civilian review and board to discipline the police, but they were greeted by 50 officers holding nightsticks. 200 pickets, mainly white and Puerto Rican, were situated in front of the school by noon, chanting "Stop killer cops, we want legal protection, and end police brutality." 250 people attended James Powell's funeral under strict supervision of barricaded policemen. At the same time, another patrol was watching over a demonstration on the rising crime rate in Harlem. Both events ended peacefully with no incident. Reverend Nelson C. Jukes then called for action, leading the march to the 28th Precinct, supported by black nationalist Edward Millis Davis and James Lawson. After meeting with Inspector Pendergast, the committee addressed the crowd, but it was already too late. The crowd began to throw bottles and debris at the police line. A group of rioters threw bottles and one hit Michael Doris in the face, the first police officer to be injured during the Harlem riot of 1964. A group of rioters stopped in front of the Teresa Hotel, where a Molotov cocktail was thrown on a police car, injuring one officer. Police officers received permission to draw their firearms and fired into the air to occupy the Harlem area. According to Inspector Pendergast's announcement, one rioter died, 12 policemen and 19 civilians were injured, and 30 were arrested. Over 22 stores had been looted. The report of Pendergast was hotly contested by the hospital that counted 7 gunshot wounds and 110 people who considered their injuries worth intensive care. A scheduled rally organised by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, in the afternoon of Saturday, July 18th, changed its focus upon the arrival of Lewis Smith, the CORE field secretary. The rally had the objective to clarify on 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi who went missing, thus looking over the shooting of James Powell, as well as pointing out the police brutality as a constant threat upon the black community. After most of the reporters had left, Judith Howell, a young high school student and a member of the Bronx chapter of CORE, climbed on a chair and said, "We've got a civil rights bill, and along with the bill we've got Barry Goldwater and a dead black boy. The shooting of James Powell was murder." After her speech, the cry was for action and was followed by Reverend Nelson C. Jukes from the Fountain Springs Baptist Church, who after 20 minutes of the speech led the crowd to the 20th Precinct, supported by black nationalist Edward Mills Davis and James Lawson. Upon the arrival, the police department was in motion, and Inspector Pendergast accommodated the committee formed by Jukes, Charles Russell of East River CORE, Charles Taylor and Newton Sewell, black nationalists, and their only demand was the suspension of Lieutenant Gilligan. The antagonism between the community and the New York Police Department heightened as taunted policemen, as well as firemen, who would later use hoses on protesters in broad daylight throughout Sunday. James Farmer, the national director of CORE, who attended the riot, confirmed the assumption of police brutality and testified to seeing bullet holes in windows and walls of the Teresa Hotel. He also claimed Inspector Pendergast was at the origin of the riot. Bayard Rustin, engineer of the March on Washington and the New York's first school boycott, received cries of disapproval from the crowd and then decided to lead a crew of 75 volunteers to keep an outpost on 125th Street and 8th Avenue, constituting an aid for teenagers and women in the closing riot. Other speakers at the rally tried to reason with the crowd to join in a peaceful protest. The mob moved to the Delaney Funeral Home, where a service for Powell's death had been scheduled for 8 p.m. At that point, someone threw a bottle at the police, and the police threw it back into the crowd. The riot had started once again. Bricks and bottles were falling from rooftops like rain from clouds. Bayard Rustin and other speakers were trying to convince the rioters to save their souls, but they were booed and the crowd shouted back at them. After a Molotov cocktail had been thrown, some police lowered their guns and wounded 2 young men as they charged. The riot was scattered by midnight and grew out of proportion once again after some disturbance. Many Molotov cocktails were used by protesters, and 2 more young men were wounded by bullets. 1 policeman had a heart attack, and the violence ended around 1:30 in the morning. And reports counted 27 policemen and 93 civilians were injured. 108 were arrested and 45 stores had been looted. Hospitals, however, counted more than 200 entries in the registers. The situation was quieter in the street of Harlem on Monday. Paul R. Scrivine confirmed that a New York County grand jury would look into the murder of James Powell. The riot started after the UN demonstration to protest terrorism and genocide committed against black Americans. The Brooklyn Core branch had prepared an all-day march for Monday in support of the rioters in Harlem. They protested the shooting of young Powell and denounced police brutality against Harlemites. The police enforcement, which had kept a low profile, suddenly called for reinforcements.
Here in Detroit, a city of war, where snipers hide on rooftops, the violence continues. U.S. Army paratroopers, National Guardsmen, state and local police are continuing the fight against a handful of snipers. On the city's west side, a 150-block area is off limits to everybody. This is no man's land, an area of destruction and devastation. ABC newsman Tom McIntyre says it's hard to believe that this could happen in America. But here it is in Detroit, the nation's fifth-largest city.
To the sound of sirens and tires, the reinforcements arrived at their destination, and the police charged the mob, making no apparent distinction between innocents and enemies. The riots stopped at a little after 7 in the morning, and CORE announced a new rally in no less than 12 hours. Tuesday in Brooklyn started by a meeting of all VIPs of black organisations, with Captain Edward Jenkins, commanding officer of the 79th Precinct at the Bedford YMCA. Over the day, they looked at plausible explanations of the riot's cause and also Lieutenant Gilligan's case. The riot started again and police charged the mob, while angry rioters threw bottles and debris at them. Everything was under control by 2 a.m. on Wednesday. On Wednesday night, a troop of mounted police officers was set at the four corners of the intersection of Fulton and Nostrand. When the crowd that had formed in front of the truck was of a reasonable size, Fleary, one of the NAACP workers, addressed the crowd. He claimed that their community was a community of law. Furthermore, he insisted that the riots weren't how they were going to get what they wanted. The mob seemed to generally agree with him until a group of men, among them 4 were wearing a green beret, appeared across the street and approached the truck. They started to rock the truck while the mob got more and more agitated. Fleary will remain the only community leader affirming the presence of external agitators. When Fleary lost control of the microphone, the police charged to rescue the NAACP crew and had the effect of starting another riot.
One of the shrewd ways that they use the press to project us in the eye or image of a criminal, they take statistics. And with the press, they feed these statistics to the public, primarily the white public. Because there are some well-meaning persons in the white public as well as bad-meaning persons in the white public. And whatever the government is going to do, it always wants the public on its side. And whether it's the local government, state government, federal government.
Has the jury reached a verdict in this matter with regard to the charges of murder in the first degree and assault?
We have, Your Honor. On the assault, not guilty. As to the murder charges, not guilty.
It's been a long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will.